Whitehouse walked Trump's OMB pick through 50 years of Supreme Court precedent on impoundment. The Ford rescission is dead. Then he named the 900 ocean sensors Trump is removing without Congress.
Questions? Yeah, Mark.
Mr. Duncan, you mentioned that President Ford in 1975 had done a pocket rescission. Are you aware of other pocket rescissions up to the current administration?
Senator, no, not off the top of my head.
Okay, well, the reason why is because after that Ford decision occurred, you had several Supreme Court decisions. One of them made it very clear that in general, any sort of impoundment is unacceptable, and rescission is done without Congress as a form of impoundment. And then you had a 1983 decision that said both houses have to vote affirmatively on a rescission. That's actually in the 1974 Act, so it reaffirmed what the Act said, that a rescission had to be done. And then Clinton versus New York ruled out the line item veto, which is essentially a rescission. Pocket rescission is kind of like a line item veto. That's why it's never happened since Ford. So I just wanted to note that that foundation in law, the Ford example doesn't at all address legitimacy or illegitimacy. The law still says any rescission must be done and signed by both houses of Congress, or must be passed by both houses of Congress. Second, I was very concerned that the budget submitted for this last year did not have any deficit and debt projections. The law actually requires the budget that the president submits to have deficit and debt information. Will you push to make sure deficit and debt information is in the next submission to Congress?
Senator, I appreciate the question. And as Director Vought testified when he was up here discussing the budget, our budget for FY27 was a discretionary budget. We wanted to help kick off the
No, I understand, but the
27
law requires deficit and debt. Will you work to follow the law in the next submission to Congress?
Senator, certainly will work to follow the law. I want to note that we will release additional projections of that sort like we did last year in the mid-session review, which will come this summer.
I want to know that when Vought did testify, he said he didn't follow the law because he didn't want to confuse the American public. Two problems with that. First of all, that says the American public are idiots. They're not idiots. They follow deficit and debt very closely. This is a big problem for the United States of America. And second of all, he is not authorized to break the law. And if you're working for him as a deputy, I hope you'll raise a yellow flag if he seeks to break the law again by not putting deficit and debt into. I raised another issue, was the shutdown of programs that are authorized and funded. And right now, there's a program called the Ocean Observatories Initiative that has 900 sensors in the ocean. And the administration announced that it is going to take out 4 of the 5 arrays of these ocean sensors, which measure current direction, temperature, phytoplankton, acidity, salinity, and so forth, which are pretty much important information about the oceans. Congress has not asked these sensors to be taken out. They've not asked this program to be shut down. And there is a law on the books that says that to undo a program that's over $2.5 million in the Commerce, Justice, and Science, funded through the Commerce, Justice, and Science, there has to be, even if it's just being decommissioning it, it has to have a 30-day notice to Congress. Are you familiar with whether any such 30-day notice was given?
Senator, I'm not familiar with the program in question. I would have to defer to the Department of Commerce on that. And I would really quick note that Director Vought, when he was up here testifying on not including mandatory, what he said was in context of of another reconciliation bill coming down the pike. So I just wanted to contest the characterization of how it was framed in terms of what he was discussing when he put forward that assertion about just putting a mandatory budget forward.
You mean the assertion about not confusing the public, that assertion?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Well, I don't think there's any, okay. I understand why you would want to defend the director. I did not find wanting to not confuse the country as a legitimate reason to hide the deficit and debt numbers. Really hope because both Democrats and Republicans have weighed in and said, don't dismantle this ocean array. It's authorized, it's funded, and the law requires notice to Congress. And it is, but from every scientist we can talk to, I mean, sheer stupidity to pull out an array that costs hundreds of millions. Its information's been used in over 500 studies. It's an example of what I'm talking about, of the administration trying to respect the separation of powers. If Congress says to you, take it out, fine. If they do that by law. But when it's authorized and funded and the administration just says, well, we don't like this program, so we'll rip it out, that's not okay. My final point. I just want to emphasize that the actions that have been taken in which grants are awarded preferentially to states that have either state leadership or federal elected leadership that is red rather than blue, that's unacceptable. Will you pledge to keep the sense of not having grants allocations, I guess, contaminated by partisan undertakings or influences?
Senator, certainly commit to ensuring that grants are spent in accordance with the law, but fundamentally in accordance with the president's priorities as well.
Okay, but that didn't answer my question. So will you commit to keeping partisan influence out of the award of grant programs?
Senator, obviously the American people elected the president, as we discussed last night. He's given discretion within the boundaries of the statutes to award grants based off of his policy views. So we'll certainly commit to abiding by the law and effectuating the president's
All right.
agenda.
So I have to wrap this up, but
Yes, you do.
hope that view will change. Just think about it. If there was a president, I don't think anyone would say it's okay to just award grants to states with no leadership. That's just
What made this White House exchange land was its precision. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, walked Hal Duncan, the nominee for the No. 2 position at the Office of Management and Budget, through the legal foundation underneath the pocket rescission concept. The administration had cited a 1975 action by President Ford as a precedent. Whitehouse's response was to walk through what happened to that precedent in the law in the 50 years since. A pocket rescission is a procedural device by which the executive branch attempts to cancel appropriated spending without an active congressional vote. The mechanism works by withholding spending in the final weeks of the fiscal year. By the time Congress could act, the fiscal year ends and the spending lapses. It is the budget equivalent of running out the clock. The legality of the mechanism depends on whether the courts and Congress treat the withholding as an impoundment, which is the technical term for the executive branch refusing to spend money Congress has appropriated. In 1974, Congress passed the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act. The act was a direct response to disputes between the legislative and executive branches over the executive's authority to refuse to spend appropriated funds. The act establishes that any rescission of appropriated spending requires affirmative votes of both houses of Congress. The act distinguishes between deferrals, which are temporary delays, and rescissions, which are cancellations. Whitehouse's procedural point is that the act has been the governing law since 1974, 3 years before the Ford precedent the administration cited. Whitehouse walked Duncan through 2 Supreme Court decisions that tightened the law against impoundment after the 1975 Ford action. The first, decided in 1983, addressed the requirement that both houses of Congress affirmatively vote on a rescission. The decision reaffirmed the structure of the 74 Act. The second was Clinton versus New York, decided in 1998. That decision struck down the line item veto, which had been an attempt by Congress to delegate to the president a power to selectively cancel specific items within an appropriations bill. The connection Whitehouse drew between Clinton versus New York and the current pocket rescission concept is the structural one. A pocket rescission is, in effect, a line item veto by another name. The president identifies specific appropriated items, declines to spend them, and runs out the clock until the fiscal year ends and the money lapses. The legal effect on the appropriation is identical to a line item veto. The Supreme Court ruled in 1998 that a line item veto is unconstitutional under the presentment clause. That ruling, in Whitehouse's framing, applies to the pocket mechanism as well. In 1975, the legal landscape that constrains executive impoundment today did not yet exist in its current form. The '74 Act had just been passed and had not yet been tested in court. The 1983 decision had not yet been decided. Clinton versus New York was 23 years in the future. President Ford's action in 1975 was the last instance of the technique because, in Whitehouse's framing, the law evolved through the 50 years since to specifically rule it out. The Ford precedent is not a usable precedent in the current legal environment. Duncan, when asked whether he was aware of other pocket rescissions in the half-century since the Ford action, said he was not aware off the top of his head. Whitehouse's reply was direct. The reason there have been none, he said, is because the law evolved to make them unworkable. The framing implies that the administration's revival of the technique is not the resurrection of a legitimate but disused tool. It is the use of a tool the law has specifically ruled out. The framing places the burden of justification on the administration. Whitehouse then pivoted to a separate but related concern. The budget that the president submitted for the most recent fiscal year did not include deficit and debt projections. There is a statute on the books that specifically requires the president's budget submission to Congress to include those projections. The reason for the requirement is straightforward. Congress cannot evaluate a budget without understanding the deficit and debt picture the budget would produce. The omission was a direct departure from the law's requirement. OMB Director Russell Vought testified earlier in the year that he omitted the deficit and debt projections because, in his account, including them would have confused the American public. Whitehouse made two responses. The first was that the framing of the American public as confused is, in his words, an insult. The American public follows deficit and debt very closely. The second response was that even if the framing were accurate, the OMB director is not authorized to decline to follow the law because he thinks the law is confusing to readers. Whitehouse then asked Duncan a direct question. Will you work to follow the law in the next budget submission? Duncan said he would certainly work to follow the law. He added that OMB will release additional projections of that sort in the mid-session review coming this summer. The commitment is now on the record. The next budget submission, if Duncan is confirmed, will be measurable against the statute he committed to follow. Whitehouse also asked Duncan to raise what he called a yellow flag if Vought again proposed to omit the required projections. Whitehouse then named a specific program the administration is in the process of shutting down. The Ocean Observatories Initiative is a National Science Foundation-funded program that operates 900 sensors in the world's oceans. The sensors measure current direction, temperature, photoplankton concentration, acidity, salinity, and a range of related ocean conditions. The administration announced that it will remove 4 of the 5 arrays of sensors. The data the sensors collect is foundational for climate science, fisheries management, and naval operations. Whitehouse then made the specific legal point about program shutdowns. There is a statute that constrains how programs above a certain dollar threshold in the Commerce, Justice, Science, and Related Agencies Appropriations Bill can be terminated. The general principle is that the executive branch cannot unilaterally shut down a congressionally authorized and funded program of that size without notice to and engagement with Congress. The Ocean Observatories Initiative, in Whitehouse's framing, exceeds the threshold and was not subject to the required process. The shutdown is, in his view, another impoundment in substance, if not in name. Each of the items Whitehouse raised is an example of the same underlying constitutional dispute. Pocket rescissions, omitted budget submissions, program shutdowns. All 3 are instances of the executive branch acting unilaterally on appropriated spending or required reporting without engaging Congress. The dispute is not new. It runs back through every administration in the modern budget era. What is new is the scale and frequency of the unilateral actions and the specific legal theories under which they are being defended. Whitehouse was placing each item into that longer arc. The reason the number 2 role at OMB matters specifically for these issues is structural. The deputy director participates in every contested impoundment decision, every contested rescission, every contested program shutdown. The role is not ceremonial. The deputy director signs off on the operational implementation of the decisions OMB makes. A nominee who declines to commit, on the record, to follow the law on deficit projections or to raise a flag on future impoundments is a different signal than a nominee who makes those commitments. The procedural craft of the exchange is worth noting. Whitehouse used the hearing to build a record for future litigation and for future congressional oversight. The Ford precedent walkthrough is now on the record. The Vought rationale rebuttal is now on the record. The Ocean Observatory's legal point is now on the record. Duncan's commitment to follow the law on the next budget submission is now on the record. Each of those records will be cited in future court filings, in future committee correspondence, and in future floor speeches. What the committee will do with this record is mechanical. The committee will report the nomination, favorably or otherwise, to the full Senate. The full Senate will hold a floor vote. Each senator will weigh the record according to their own judgment. Senators inclined to support the nomination will cite the commitments Duncan made on the record about following the law. Senators inclined to oppose the nomination will cite the broader pattern of administration actions Whitehouse placed into the record. Both readings are available within the same transcript. This exchange will be studied as a clean teaching case on impoundment law for years to come. The exchange walks through the relevant precedents in chronological order. It connects them to a specific current administration action. It elicits a commitment from a nominee that can be measured against future conduct. Law school, constitutional law, and administrative law classes will likely use it. Congressional staff drafting new appropriations language will reference it. Federal litigators on both sides of impoundment cases will cite it. That is what a well-constructed confirmation exchange does. The nonpartisan heart of the exchange is worth naming. The legal framework Whitehouse cited applies across administrations. The Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act was passed in 1974 during the Ford administration. The '83 decision was decided during the Reagan administration. Clinton versus New York was decided during the Clinton administration. The line item veto Congress attempted to delegate was a Republican-led initiative. The legal framework is bipartisan in origin and applies to every executive equally. That is the framework Whitehouse was placing on the record. Duncan committed to two specific things in this exchange. He committed to work to follow the law in the next budget submission, including the required deficit and debt projections. He committed to release additional projections in the mid-session review coming this summer. Those commitments are testable against future conduct. If the next budget submission again omits the required projections, the commitment will have been broken on the record. If the mid-session review includes the projections, the commitment will have been kept. The record now contains both the obligation and the commitment. So the final accountability question is the standard one: what was gained, what was lost, and who is paying the cost? What the public gained is a clean walkthrough of impoundment law as it stands today, placed in the formal hearing record by the chairman of the Budget Committee. What the public also gained is a set of testable commitments from the nominee on future budget submissions. What was lost was a chance to hear a substantive engagement on the merits of the pocket rescission concept itself. The committee can decide. The full Senate can decide. The public can decide what kind of OMB it wants administering the laws Congress writes.